Okay, well, thank you so much, Elizabeta, and hello, everyone from New York City. I really appreciate, Elizabeta, you're giving the European perspective with respect to the human rights frameworks and instruments that have been created. And I think this perspective is very important. I appreciate your asking me about the G20 Interfaith Forum. I also wanted to put this in the larger frame of the work of the United Nations, as well as the international legal instruments, conventions, etc., that has been created by the United Nations. However, specifically with respect to your question, let me explain, first of all, what the G20 Interfaith Forum is. And it builds on the vital roles that religious institutions and beliefs play in world affairs. And it reflects the rich diversity of institutions, ideas, and values. And these include interfaith and intercultural organizations, religious leaders, scholars, development and humanitarian entities, and business and civil society actors. So there is a recognition that multilateral engagement is an important means of acknowledging the significant role of stakeholders that represent different aspects of our global and local communities. So this necessarily reflects already the diversity that exists in our world. And racism is a very complex issue, and it touches upon all levels in society in its institutional, structural, cultural, and systemic manifestations. And the IF20's anti-racism initiative, which I chair, sees racism as a cross-cutting issue that addresses the many different ways in which racism is prevalent in society. And this initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 to work towards the eradication of racism and to work towards advancing the goal of racial equality and equity by every means available. So the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was created by the United Nations, says it solemnly affirmed the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and securing understanding of and respect for the human dignity of human persons. And it is convinced that the doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory and in practice anywhere. So the Anti-Racism Initiative specifically affirms its commitment to and support of all international instruments outlawing racism in all its forms, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, people are not to be commodified or instrumentalized, but really cherished. And as people of faith, we affirm the precious worth of every life as an obvious consequence of divine love and compassion. And now with respect to, because the IF20 really does work with policy recommendations and the intersectionality of civil society and the G20 summit leaders, the IF20's anti-racism initiative has come out with a specific policy recommendation to the G20 summit leaders about creating a commission to study this aspect of racism and to have, a panel of experts convened and to really make recommendations to the G20 summit leaders on how we can best address this issue of racism. So, Elizabeta, you also raised a very important part that regardless of all of these international instruments that have been created, you've, mentioned the European Union, and of course, because of our many years of work with the United Nations itself has also created a lot of international legal instruments, beginning with its own preamble and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the preamble to the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and all the many, the 3 world conferences it's held on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances, which are held in 1978, 1983, and 2001. And so it's also held observances, which include an International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, an International Day of Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Nelson Mandela International Day, and the UNESCO International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. So the UN has established also certain years to observe racism, such as the International Year of Action to Combat Racism and Racial Discrimination, as well as decades. For example, the Decade for Action to Combat Racism and Racial Discrimination. So what we do see, and I think I build on what Elizabeta has opened her remarks with, is that yes, there are a vibrant, robust international legal instruments which seeks to address the racism issue and the discrimination issue. But she also asks a deep question with respect to posed in the question about what can religious theologians and religious institutions do to really address this aspect of the pervasiveness and the persistence of racism. Well, first of all, we have to understand that racism comes out of this need for self-interest and self-protection, and the perceptual fields that are created by our own, enculturations, etc. So, like, for example, in the United States, we have this growing anti-racism that has been affecting not only people, the Black people, but Asian people, and immigrant populations. So it is this perception that the perceived incursion of people within your own community, and of course, I think Europe is also experiencing this, a huge anti-immigrant backlash, that it speaks to, and the polarization politically as well, especially unfortunately within religious communities that perceive the incursion of foreigners as taking away their livelihood, their identities, their culture, and so they frame it as a threat. And part of the work of the religious communities is to be able to address these aspects of racism. So, diversity is one of the words that we hear often in our culture today. And in the United States, we are increasingly becoming more diverse along racial and ethnic lines. And according to the Brookings Institute in 2019, nearly 40% of the United States is now non-white compared to 30% in 2000. So the Census Bureau projects that by the year 2045, which is just around the corner, the United States will be majority non-white. So the surveys from Pew and Barna have also shown the growing religious diversity in the United States, and with those identifying as Christian declining and those identifying as religiously unaffiliated on the rise. So the U.S. has been a country of immigrants, and we continue to see the influx of immigrant populations today. So the diversity has definitely caused political and societal tensions and polarizations. And as we witness the growing fear of these diverse groups of people coming into the country, who also want to benefit from their own ideations of what America stands for. So the global diversity perspective gave its definition of diversity as empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different. And it means understanding one another by surpassing simple tolerance to ensure people truly value their differences. And I want to cite the work of Queensborough Community College here in New York, which really prides itself for its diversity. And this is what they say about it. Diversity means more than just acknowledging and or tolerating difference. Diversity is a set of conscious practices that involve understanding and appreciating interdependence of humanity, cultures, and the natural environment, practicing mutual respect for qualities and experiences that are different from our own, understanding that diversity includes not only ways of being, but also ways of knowing, recognizing that personal, cultural, and institutionalized discrimination creates and sustains privileges for some while creating and sustaining disadvantages for others, and that building alliances across differences so that we can work together to eradicate all forms of discrimination is very important. So with respect to the question that you had posed for this seminar that's in your flyer, what can theologians do? And I will posit that it would be good for theologians, and not just theologians, but every single one of us, to share some of the beautiful references made to this concept of unity in diversity, which is really a spiritual value common to many religious and faith traditions. And I'll just cite, some examples here. So the Muslim Sufi author Abdul al-Qadim al-Jili, in his book, Universal Man, described the universe as unity in diversity and diversity in unity. And in the Hindu concept of Advaita Vedanta, the external world and Brahman, the ultimate reality, are not separate. It is a philosophy of non-duality that sees Brahman as real, but the world in which we live as an illusion, and all the diverse aspects of the external world are in fact unified in Brahman. And the unity and diversity concept is a really essential principle in the Baha'i faith. So Abdul Baha said, in reality, all are members of one family, children of one heavenly Father. Humanity may be likened unto vari-colored flowers of one garden, and there is unity in diversity. Each sets off and enhances the other's beauty. So in recent times, three giants of modern thought, leadership, and inspiration have been Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And they advocated for inclusion and unity in their history-making missions. And Dr. King beautifully stated that life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. So if we look to our own religious sacred texts and scriptures, we will see that the articulation of the spiritual value of being able to see the beauty of the unifying force in the field of diversity is a very important aspect to be able to embrace and to practice. And Mother Teresa said, only humility will lead us to unity, and unity will lead us to peace. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, if we wish to ensure everyone's peace and happiness, we need to cultivate a healthy respect for the diversity of our peoples and cultures, founded on an understanding of this fundamental sameness of all human beings. So we strive to be able to understand each other in our diversity. And, neighbor love is very complex and challenging because it requires moral transformation in our own basic values, practices, and institutions. So this means we have to examine ourselves and the kinds of prejudices and biases that we have. And it also compels us to be innovative, finding new solutions to old problems. And all of this makes life really, Elizabetha, a grand adventure of discovery of ourselves, each other, and life itself. So thank you very much. Thank you so much, Elizabeta. This is a very important question because historically religions have been very instrumental in helping to address humanitarian work. So they, through their faith, they have done selfless service. They serve the poor. They feed the hungry. They serve their communities in need, regardless of race, color, and religion. And it has been truly a remarkable history of helping one another. So they've really stepped in when governments could not fill the gaps, especially in times of disasters. And they certainly need to continue in that vein. And since our global challenges are becoming more complex, as we try to accommodate the nearly 8 billion people in the world, we do look to our communities of faith to continue to help their neighbors in need. So that has been an important role of religious communities. But also, we have to examine the financial infrastructures, the economic infrastructures that have been creating more and more the accumulation of wealth into fewer hands, the loss of the moderating balance, the fulcrum point of society, which is the middle class and the growing masses of poor. And there has to be a deep analysis as to why this is coming about. And I will posit to you that the economic financial infrastructures that we have created, especially within the last 70 years, that have built its power on countries of dominance, on that dominant paradigm, whether through the history of colonialism, the slave trade, etc., where the commodification of people into commodities rather than as human beings. So the slave trade, etc. So what we have the examination here of is the disparity in the power dynamics. So we cannot look at the current situation on the global landscape without really examining the power dynamics and the infrastructures that have been created that basically perpetuate that power into the hands of, colonial interests. We have neocolonialism today in its many manifestations. So what can religious communities do? I think religious communities are looking into that examination and are, also having vibrant civil society participation in non-secular ways, even though they have, a religious base. So I think that they continue to work very diligently in helping to serve communities in need. At the same time, I think that they are looking at more and more the critical analysis as to whether or not the economic power structures and the fact that these economic power structures now see the national security interest of the member states to be access to resources. And so the wars that have been created and may continue to be created over access and acquisition of resources as a national security interest for the member states becomes especially important as part of the critique of the economic power structures and what religious communities must look at more deeply and how they can also address it.